ready, but yeah, as a teacher, we are supposed to be ready all the time. So the presentation, as you can see, is based on foundation phase, and it's also looking at pre-service teachers. Now, as a teacher educator at a school of education in South Africa, obviously what is very important is that we focus on So we focus on how we work with our pre-service teachers. And here, if my work is in science education, then I'm particularly concerned with how we work with pre-service education, foundation phase, but also science education. So there are three aspects that we are focusing on. But I'm also going to insert another aspect, which is also literacy education as well. So in looking at what we need to work with, we know that in terms of science, the field of science is so dynamic. And when we're working with young children, we have to take into consideration the dynamics and how these are then used and implemented within the field. We cannot work with science in a very staid, uninteresting manner. But I think what is even more important is that when we work with foundation phase, and we know that foundation phase teachers are more focused on literacy and numeracy, they're not really focused on science per se. Then we have to start questioning, what is it that these particular teachers are working with when they are expected to work with natural science in the foundation phase? And therefore, a question to be considered is, what are the teachers' understandings of science? And we have to then look at, if the teachers do not understand what science is, how can they then be expected to teach it? So in the frame of pre-service teacher education, we need to consider the whole meaning of science. And it actually follows the Elena's presentation very nicely, because she was looking at the meaning of mathematics, or the definition of mathematics. We did work, myself and colleagues, Benny and Steers, and we were looking at the curriculum for the foundation phase. And what we found is that in that curriculum for the foundation phase, science is present, but it's present as natural science. But there's not much in terms of the guidance on how science needs to be taught. So the teachers have a curriculum document. It tells them what the content is. It gives them examples of what they can do, but it does not give direct information on how to teach science. And that can be very difficult for people, as you can see from the first one, or the second one as well, who do not even have an understanding of science. Okay, so we looked at the issues linked to science. Now let's look at the issues that are also linked to literacy. So with regard to science, remember that it's not just the contents of science, but it is also the process skills that need to be worked with. And therefore, when we look in the South African context, it's not just about science, but it's also literacy. And if you look at the second point there, the international study that is being done with over 40 countries, it's referred to as the Progress in International Reading Literacy. 78% of the grade 4 learners in South Africa could not read for meaning. So now, as a science teacher, you have to think about the fact that you are teaching science. But you also have to think further than that. In a context where literacy is a problem, how are you then going to also integrate literacy in the science as well? And that is why we need to start thinking about the early literacy activities. So now, if we're now looking at setting the scene, so it's pre-service teachers. Within teacher education, we're looking at science education, but we're also looking at literacy development within the science education. So how do we bring the two together? So in terms of a program that was designed, and I designed this program for a university, not our university, but UNISA, which is the University of South Africa. I was contracted to design this, and this is what, after a number of months, this is what was developed. But what was important in designing the program for any teacher, for any pre-service teacher education module or course or whatever is going to happen, one has to take into account the theoretical aspects. But more than just the theoretical aspects, what are the concepts that the pre-service teachers need to understand? But before we even go there, what is their initial understanding? So how do we now explore what they initially thought of what science is? Now that we take their initial understanding, how then do we work with these concepts that we're going to work with? And what is also very important is that in science it's not just the development of concepts, but it's also the development of process skills. And quite clearly, I think what we lack in teaching science is just to talk about, well, the sun shines in the morning, or the sun is at peak at 12 o'clock, but do we go out? Do we do the measurements? Do we do the observations? All those are very important for any type of development, for even the pre-service teachers, because remember, they're going to go out and teach. So it's also about the application of the different teaching and learning strategies as well. And in terms of looking at this, this story is a story that I wrote. And if you look at the story, and I will quickly read the story for you, as what would be done with young learners. So the sun is big, round, and shining. It is 11 o'clock in the morning during the summer season. Tina, Tandi, Lindo, Carol, and Ian are all playing in the school garden. They were chasing one another, playing the game catch. They decided to stop running. So I could read it like that, or I could read it with action. They were running and then they stopped, okay? Lindo and Carol sat on the swings and the others laid on the grass, partly under a tree. They all had perspiration running down their faces. Their breathing was heavy and they felt their hearts beating fast in their chests. They looked at one another and made statements like, "Your face is so wet, you are breathing so fast," and asked questions like, "Are you tired? Why do our hearts beat so fast? How do we know it is our heart? Why do we perspire? Why is the chain of the swing so hot and the seat cool?" And looking around them, they started feeling cooler and they stopped perspiring. Lindo said, "Sometimes when I run, I do not perspire and I do not feel hot." The children started discussing this and they tried to work out why this was the case. So that's the story that is now given to the pre-service teachers. And the pre-service teachers could use this story even in a classroom setting. And one could say, so how could you be teaching science here? Where's the science in all of this? This is just a story. So when we look at science and the story, the one question is, and this is given to pre-service teachers, how will you respond to the questions that the learners asked? And then you, as the teacher, you have to think, Should I be responding to the question, or should I ask the learners to discuss this? And as they are discussing it, give them pieces of paper, give them crayons, give them things to draw with. Let them go run outside and let them experience some of this. And then come back and have discussions. The second one, what are your ideas or responses to the story concerning science? And I would love for us, if we were having a conversation, to say, how are you going to address these questions? I'll give you 1 minute. There's 3 questions. 1 minute. How are you going to respond to this? Think about it. You've got 3 questions there. And I'll ask anybody, Rita, if you respond to the first one, because you foundation phase, I know, and you do lots of lovely work. The second one and the third one. 1 minute. Okay. So the first one, Rita, how would you respond to the first one? tell him in Lithuanian and he can say it in English. Oh, okay. Any responses to these questions? Yes? No, these 3 questions. These 3 questions are linked to the story. And what makes the story about science as well? Zuleka, come on, Zuleka. Okay. So, there are elements of science presented in the story. Did you notice? It spoke about the weather. It spoke about the seasons. It spoke about the children's body, my body, because that's part of foundation phase. It spoke about play, and it also spoke about heat, how heat is conducted. And when we run as well, on a hot day, we're going to perspire. So there's the interplay between heat and our bodies. And it's so significant, and also the season. So how do we integrate whatever we're doing with our learners all the time? So there's the literacy in science that we need to be conscious of. How much time do I have? I will rush. Okay, here's another story. And I quickly went through that, but here's another story. And I tried to make the stories a bit different. The first story really is about the child related to himself or herself or itself. And it's important for us to start with identity and children understanding who they are in relation to their environment. That was the first story. The second story now is about something other than the child. So it's about another organism, and the organism is a snail. And why did I choose particularly a snail? Children are intrigued by snails. And if you think about that snail that's moving along, and the fact that, as the story says, it leaves a trail, it is so important that when we're thinking about the process skills of science, they all come out in the story as well. So, I can't see the first part of it. But anyway, it's 3 snails in a container, and the children are observing the 3 snails in the container. And then the teacher asked the children to draw the snail. Now, why would a teacher ask the children to draw a snail? And I think, I didn't put a vision. What's snail in Polish? What's snail in Polish? Ślimak. Ah, okay. So, why would you ask children to draw a snail? Is it as simple as drawing an earthworm? No. Remember, the snail has a head, it's got tentacles, it's got a body with a gastro foot, so it's got a gastropod, and the pod is flat, and it's also got a shell. And that shell has a concentric circle. So look at all the shapes that the children then have to take into account. And the tentacle has got a stalk and it's a round tip. And that is very significant. So if you're asking them to draw a snail in comparison to drawing an earthworm, a snail is at another level of complexity. And that's what we have to think about when we're working with our learners. Yes, work from the simple to the complex, but we have to get to the complex. So what also happens with the snail is that there are zigzag lines that the snail leaves as it moves. The teacher, I'm reading from there, the teacher then asked the children to touch the actual zigzag lines in the container. 2 children were happy to do this, and the other 3 were reluctant. There's attitude development. There's interest that we're looking at as well. So when we're working with content, it's knowledge development, it's process skill development, but it's also attitude and values. So where children are reluctant to touch the slime, those who have touched, when they describe, those who have not touched are going to be, I also want to touch, I also want to feel. So we but we engage children in activities for them to excite other children. And that's where the peer learning comes in so significantly. At this stage, the last part, the teacher asked, so what is it and why is it there in terms of the slime? The children raised their hands and shared their thinking or responses to the question. What is science in all of this? And now let's look at the questions that we look at. Why do you think the children said, and why do you think they said this? So why do you say, okay, about the slime and why they spoke about the zigzag nature of that slime. So why do you think it was possible for the children to share their thinking and responses? Name 3 things that you think made it possible for the learners to share their thinking and responses. And these are really questions that we as teacher educators need to think about when we are engaging our pre-service teachers, and when we think about these pre-service teachers who are going to be teachers. And what is it that we are looking at in terms of their experiential learning and the application of that learning when they are in the classroom setting? So for us, it's really significant that when we design activities for our pre-service teachers, it's not just about science and the teaching of science content. It's science content, it is process skills, it is attitude, it is literacy, it is understanding myself as an individual, and how we put that into the context of where all this teaching actually takes place. So there you have it. There's observations taking place, there's recording taking place. And lastly, to conclude, when we're working with our pre-service teachers, as I said, it's the development of content, it's the development of skills, it's the development and the understanding of the different teaching and learning strategies that we need to be working with. And it's so important that there's inquiry-based teaching, even in a story. And if you look at those stories, there were questions involved, and with inquiry-based, whether we're looking at the 5E or the 6E model, those are all present within the stories. So it really starts from even pre-service teachers being able to structure their own stories. And you do not have to use it from a textbook, because sometimes textbooks do not take all the aspects into account, they just give content. So using narratives to teach science is something that really needs to be worked with within the South African context, because the issue of language development is so significant. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela, for your interesting speech.